So on Monday, I lamented and expressed maybe a little bit of my frustration with the fact that Christians don't seem to be standing up or lovingly in their argumentation or in the ways in which they're disagreeing with other kinds of people. And I suggested that maybe it's time for the loving Christians to stand up and to get involved. Now, the question for many of us is, what does that look like? Because for too many, it seems like, well, loving your neighbor is just simply accepting whatever is going on in that space and affirming however they see the world, which of course is not what the Bible or what Jesus encourages us to do. That's not the way Jesus lived his life. And so we are called to engage and to even oppose certain things. But then the other side of the extreme is that some people seem to take all of the tactics and the ways in which other people in the world who aren't necessarily living lovingly, and they engage in that. And so then it turns into violence or into some angry hate speech or really seeding seeds of division and trying to cause problems. At least that's the way it seems. And so there's kind of this do nothing or really argue and fight with those with whom we disagree. But of course, Jesus outlines a different way, and he does that in Matthew 18. One of the books I've been reading is David Fitch, his Faithful Presence book. It's called 7 Disciplines That Shape the Church for Mission. And he talks about one of the times in which he and his church decided to take that seriously in Matthew 18 and actually engaged with a person in their congregation and someone that was outside of the church in this discipline of reconciliation, he calls it. So there's a man called Joe. He lost his job because he had been violent with his boss. He had not paid his rent for 2 months. He was being evicted from his apartment. He claimed the landlord had been unjust by allowing the landlord's mail to go into Joe's mailbox. And meanwhile, Joe, an ex-con who had been violent with his wife, some old painful cycles in his life were kicking in. In short, God's presence seemed to be absent from Joe's life and his various relationships, work, marriage, landlord, and so on. It was all heading for a crisis. Now, a group of his friends, so Joe seemed to be going to this church, and a group of his friends met with Joe and the landlord. They saw an openness in the landlord to gather around a table and be present to one another. He says this, following Matthew 18, verses 15 to 20, and I'd encourage you to look this up. This is about how if you have a difference, you go to that person first. If that doesn't solve the problem, then you go to maybe bring another person in, and if that doesn't solve the problem, then you go to your elders of your community. We asked to hear their grievances towards each other. So the landlord was open to these, even though he's not a Christian. And they opened the gathering by praying, "Thy kingdom come." They invited God's presence or Christ's presence into their midst. They read Matthew 18, 15 to 20, and they promised to submit or to give this whole episode to Jesus as Lord as well as to one another, being very careful to listen and to confess sin. Now, for the landlord, he says this was really, really weird, didn't understand, but wanted to engage in this. Now, they listened to Joe's accusations against the landlord. They listened to the landlord and his grievances against Joe. We asked questions. We submitted to one another. So we listened to one another and to Christ in our midst. He says there was a hush over the room as we watched entrenched power positions break down. Joe was so convicted that he actually went outside and hid in a tree for 2 hours. This is amazing. Like this is a time of confrontation for sure, but it's in a space where they've committed to being for the better of each other. Eventually, he confessed his wrongs against his landlord, feeling remorse for his sins. And while Joe was in that tree, stunningly, the landlord forgave the 2 months' rent that he was behind and added on another month free. And when Joe came back, he started to deal with the anger that was deep in his life. Abuse and pain was uncovered and forgiven. And in the coming weeks, true reconciliation began between Joe and his family members. Some healing and growth started that night between Joe and his wife. And many in the neighborhood heard what had happened. Of course, that's a crazy thing to happen in a neighborhood. Well, it shouldn't be so crazy. I'll get to that in a moment. The kingdom broke in and became visible in real socio-economic relationships. He says, it reminded me of a New Testament story. This, I think, is what it means for us to be present, to stand up as loving Christians. It doesn't mean to accept whatever is there, but it also doesn't mean that we stand up and we violently oppose different things. We make space for people to both be confronted with their sin by the power of the Holy Spirit. Remember, it's the Spirit that convicts sin, not us. And make space for healing and for hope to happen as well. Now, it's not always going to work, and this is a fairly significant story that is an example of maybe an extreme case, but I wonder if we treated our differences more like this, spent time in conversation with one another and confronted one another rather than simply dismissing or just accepting. So, how would you stand up as a loving Christian in the middle of this time when there's so much division? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're encouraged by these videos, I encourage you to subscribe so that you can see the content as it comes along.